My name is Mark Welsh, for those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, and I'm the Dean of the Bush School and have the privilege of working here with phenomenal faculty, staff, and students every day thinking about the world, starting in about Navasota and expanding beyond there. Everything from public service administration to international affairs and security, and it's just an unbelievably fun place to be because we've got so much young student talent and so much faculty expertise. And part of the great thing about the Bush School is the mix of both scholar and practitioners we have on our faculty. It's valued by the students, and I think it adds value to the conversation. And one of the great opportunities we get occasionally is to bring in practitioners from around the world to speak to us about how they see the world or they're part of it and the issues that they're facing. And I have a special personal privilege today because I get to introduce one of those people to you who also happens to be a personal friend. General Dd Mercier spent a lot of time in the French Air Force. He is a Mirage pilot at his heart and always will be. He's a combat veteran, both in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. He actually brought the French Air Force on their first combat aviation deployment in Afghanistan. But he's done a number of other things in the Air Force. He was the commandant of their Air Force Academy. He's worked as the principal military advisor to their Minister of Defense and did that during the operations in Libya, you'll recall, where France was one of the great coalition partners in that effort, and Denis was the advisor to his political leadership during that time frame. And then in 2012, about the same time I became Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, Denis became Chief of Staff of the French Air Force. And we had the opportunity to work together in those roles, and I had the chance to get to know a great gentleman, a great aviator, a great professional officer, and a really, really talented international leader. He is in his job now. After his French Air Force time, he moved to NATO. Many people don't understand there is actually the Supreme Allied Commander for Operations in NATO, SAC-UR. Most people have heard of that title, but we don't really realize that there is a parallel position, the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. And the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation job is the one Denis went into after he left the Air Chief job, because they needed somebody who understood coalition combat operations. They needed someone who understood training. They needed someone who understood logistical concepts and how to evolve them for the future. And his command looks at everything from the world today and tries to figure out how we move it into the world 20 or 30 years from now. And I suspect that's where his comments will come from. He's been in the middle of NATO restructuring, NATO reorganization, and also the idea of inspiring and motivating NATO's military to come together in an even more meaningful way in the future than they have in the past. He and his wife, Anya, have been doing this for a long time. Their 3 children have suffered the sacrifices of service, just as so many of you have, or will in the future. And he also hosted my wife and I, Betty, for one of the most memorable days of our life, actually, not just our professional life, on Bastille Day in Paris one year. It was just a remarkable day all the way around, but at the end of it, he actually flew us by helicopter to the American Cemetery above Omaha Beach. We lowered the flags on the cemetery that evening, took helicopters back to Paris, and then watched the fireworks around the Eiffel Tower, which are pretty spectacular if you haven't seen that. They're worth Googling. Pretty amazing show. He's a great gentleman, and he's a great friend. More importantly, he's a very knowledgeable man about the subject for today, Europe, NATO, and the way forward. General Dd Mercier.
Good afternoon, sorry. And thank you very much, Mark, for your very kind words. Yes, we had a good time, and this time we spent in Normandy is one of my best souvenirs as an Air Force Chief as well. I will try to describe during the next 30 minutes, in order to give time to questions, what are the challenges I see for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization today, and why are we adapting again this organization, and what do we do to adapt it to be sure that it stays relevant for the challenges we meet today and those that we will see in the foreseeable future. First, it's always important to come back to where we are from. And I would like to quote just a sentence of the North Atlantic Treaty that has been signed in Washington in 1949, because that gives really the roots of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which says, safeguard the freedom, common heritage and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. And in fact, this is an organization whose value is to put together European countries and American countries with USA and Canada. And what is interesting with this Washington Treaty, if you have not read it, do it, because if we had to rewrite it today, we would not change a word. And it has been laid out in 1949. And that's really remarkable. And this is very interesting for us because we are permanently reminding people that, to face some of the challenge we have today, it's good to reread these articles of the North Atlantic Treaty 1949 because what is inside is still very relevant today. Very relevant today does not mean that NATO has not adapted since this time. And I would like to present to you what I see as the four phases of NATO's history. And this is important to understand where we are now. The first phase of NATO history was from 1949 to 1991, and it was a Cold War. It was a Cold War, and in this period, there was a strong focus on what we call collective defense, with the Article 5 of the treaty that says that an attack against one is an attack against all. And there was really a strong focus on this collective defense mission. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO opened the gates, opened the door. And then we integrated in NATO many of the former Soviet countries, such as Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and others. And in addition to that, NATO started to develop a partnership with many countries. And the first partnership initiative, what we call the Partnership for Peace, sorry, and even Russia was a member of this Partnership for Peace. And this is and this was focused this period on another task we called cooperative security, how we cooperate with other countries in order to bring more stability in our world. And this is the second phase, and the end of this second phase for me is 2001 with the 9/11. And the 9/11 was the only time in NATO's history where one nation, USA, called the Article 5 to call for the support of the other NATO nations. And it started another phase of NATO's history where we focused very much, probably too much, on expeditionary operations and crisis management, and especially with the operations in Afghanistan, but not limited to Afghanistan. And then, again, first phase, Cold War, collective defense, and cooperative security, and then a third phase with crisis management and expeditionary operations. And then, for me, a fourth phase of NATO's history opened in 2014 with the Ukraine crisis. And in this phase, we could see a violation of international laws by Russia, and then that opened another era for NATO. And in this era, this is where we are now. We have a strong focus on these three core tasks, but all together, on collective defense, on cooperative security, and on crisis management. And with the recognition of something that we may have forgotten during the third phase of the history, because again we focused on expeditionary operations, that we have potential adversaries at our borders, and we need to be sure that we have the highest level of responsiveness in order to face all the challenges. And you know that NATO, we have the treaty, and regularly NATO has issued a strategic concept, which is an update of the treaty. And the strategic concept, which is still valid today, this is a strategic concept that has been issued in 2010. And is still valid because the three core tasks, as just mentioned, are reported, and these are still the tasks that we need to fulfill. However, 2010, it was before the Ukraine crisis. 2010, it was before the Arab Spring. So what that means that even if we consider that the nations consider that the strategic concept is still valid, many of the strategic assumptions that are in the strategic concept are not any longer valid. And this is why there was this task to adapt NATO to the current environment. Before mentioning this adaptation, I would like to mention a couple of things, and especially I would like to show to you how I see the strategic environment today. And the strategic environment today is characterized by many trends. The first one is the interrelation of crisis. We have had in the past crises that were very much geographically limited, and today we have a huge interrelation of crisis, which means, for instance, that if we had a crisis in the high north, in the Baltic area with Russia, we cannot imagine that we won't have a crisis in the Black Sea or even in Syria or even everywhere we have forces deployed together. And we need to recognize it. The second thing is interrelation of threats. States and non-state actors interact differently according to geographical area. And we need to interact with them differently as well. And that's exactly what happens, again, with Russia when we look at their behavior in northern part of Europe, and we need to talk with them more when we see Syria, and many actors, again, state and non-state actors interact very differently according to geographical areas. Another trend is the emergence of new operational domains. And cyber, of course, but not only cyber, the renewed importance on space, and another domain which is a domain we need to take into account today, which is what we call the information environment and the use of medias by different actors. And finally, another trend is the blurred transition between peace and crisis with hybrid scenarios. The kind of scenarios we have seen in the Ukraine crisis is sometimes quite difficult to define that we are in peace, crisis, or conflict. And this blurred transition between peace and crisis is one of the main challenges we face today. And we'd like to mention as well the easier access to technology, again by state or non-state actors that could threaten our superiority in different areas. So based on these trends, I would like to say that we have shifted from what I call the complicated world to a complex one. A complicated world is a world where we have many factors, but we can analyze them. We can draw reasonable conclusions to drive our decisions. A complex world means that there are so many factors now interacting with each other that it is impossible to comprehend all the possible outcomes. Thereby, that makes surprise always more possible, decision-making based on imperfect information more commonplace, and failure always an option. And this requires us to make resilience a necessity. And this is what characterizes our environment today, this complexity, whether we like it or not, and we need to deal with that. And in this complexity, there is one thing we must continue to develop. This is our strategic awareness. But the strategic awareness, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic area focused on Europe and the Euro-Atlantic area. However, because of the interrelation of threats, interrelation of crisis, as I mentioned, the early sign that we need to detect a crisis or to de-escalate an emerging crisis can be found in Asia, can be found in Africa, can be found in many places. So our strategic awareness must not be only focused on the Euro-Atlantic area. We need to expand it. And this is why NATO is continuously developing a wide array of partners. And we need to continue to build these partnerships in order first to share this awareness. And just to illustrate what I've just said, first in NATO we have more than 40 partners. 5 are more partners than the others because those partners have access to some classified information the others have not. And those 5 partners are logically Finland and Sweden, but as well Georgia, Jordan, and Australia. This is just an illustration of the importance of having partners all over the world. And we have a good partnership with New Zealand as well, South Korea, and Japan, and many countries of the Mediterranean area, and the Middle East. And that's essential. So strategic awareness requires a huge exchange of information, but not only with countries, with the other international organizations as well, and with think tanks, and with academia, and with any entity that could help understand the world, detect crisis, with the aim, again, to de-escalate any emerging crisis, and not allow it to go to a conflict. So based on this, environment, how did NATO react to these changes? And I will quote some of the very important decisions that have been made in the last NATO summit, which was held in 2016 in Warsaw. You know that in NATO, the heads of state and government are permanently represented in Brussels by 29 ambassadors, and the chief of defense are permanently represented by 29 generals. But every 2 years, there is a big summit, and in this big summit, the head of state and government are present. The last one was in Warsaw, and it was a very important summit because, as I mentioned, we have entered the 4th phase of NATO's history. And the main decision of this summit were, on one hand, concerning what we call defense and deterrence, and on the other hand, what we call projecting stability, which is how we project stability out of our border in order to avoid crisis coming to our own territories. Regarding defense and deterrence, the first important decision was to deploy forces in the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and in Poland. And this is what we call the Enhance Forward Presence. And this is a renewed commitment by NATO allies to deploy forces. And those forces are, let's say, what we could call a first wave or line of forces. Just to mention clearly to Russia, if there is an attack against one, there is an attack against all, and we are all here deployed. And but behind this, American forces, Canadian forces, land forces have, for the first time since many years, redeployed land forces. And that's, it was a very important decision. We have the same kind of presence, we call it differently, a tailored forward presence, around the Black Sea area, especially in the countries of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Another decision was to make cyber an official domain, as are land, maritime, air, and space. And we are implementing this decision now, which is a very important decision to take cyber very seriously into consideration in all of our plan. Another decision was related to missile defense, where the NATO ballistic missile defense system has been declared initially operationally capable. Which was a big decision because at the political level it's always a big issue, and this was made in Warsaw as well. And finally, on defense and deterrence, there was another big decision concerning nuclear deterrence. In fact, NATO is a nuclear alliance, and has always said that it would remain a nuclear alliance as long as there would be nuclear weapons in the world. But in the recent years, Mr. Putin has said that part of the Russian doctrine, there could be use of nuclear tactical weapons. And NATO didn't want to mirror this, so the answer by NATO in the declaration of the Warsaw Summit was to say that any use of any kind of nuclear weapon by any adversary would change the nature of warfare. What does that mean? That means that any country who think that they could use nuclear weapons, even in a conventional conflict, they are wrong, because then we go for nuclear war. You are warned, and this is what we are going to do. Do not do that. Do not go to this threshold. And it was an important part of the declaration. Second, in the area of projecting stability, in the Warsaw Summit, we had a huge emphasis again on the development of partnerships and to facilitate the partnerships across the Mediterranean area, the creation of what we call a hub for the South, station in Naples, in Italy, where we invite NATO nations and partner nations to be permanently member of this hub and exchange information and try to exchange their vision of the crisis that may occur in this very important area. Another one was to another decision was to increase the partnership with a big international organization, the African Union, the United Nations, and with a strong emphasis of the European Union. And that's very important because we need, 22 nations belong to both organizations. And it's very important that we have a coherence of all of our outputs. And this joint declaration between NATO and EU recognize 7 different areas to enforce our cooperation. And based on that, we have a political framework that did not exist before in order to be sure that we can much better work together. So, and the last decision, important decision that has been made in Warsaw was to make the assessment of the NATO command structure. NATO is the only organization that has a permanent structure, which is a decision-making structure that goes from the political down to the tactical level. We call it the NATO command structure. And the 2 strategic commands, Allied Command Operation, who is in charge of the operation, led by an American, my counterpart, and me, we were tasked to assess whether the NATO command structure fit for purpose for all the challenges I just talked about. And in fact, our assessment was no. Looking at this new environment, it's only partially fit for purpose. And the nations accepted it, and they said, okay, now adapt it. And this is what we are doing. This is what we are doing today. So just to understand, to mention that, how does this work in NATO? You know, NATO is an organization made up of 29 nations. And as I mentioned, nations are permanently represented in Brussels in the international staff by 29 ambassadors. Those 29 ambassadors, they represent their nations. They make the decisions when they are 29. But the decisions in NATO are based on consensus. Every one nation has a veto right. So we need to reach a consensus, which leads many times to big discussion at the diplomatic level. And we have a military committee, as I mentioned, with a permanent, in permanence 29 generals who are representing their chief of defense. And the military committee is, when they are 29, they can give orders to SACEUR and me. So we can receive orders from the military committee when there is a consensus at 29, or by the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, the ambassadors. I do not receive any directly from my nation. We receive really our directly from the 29 nations. And that's important for the adaptation we are conducting. Just to understand the interaction between the 2 strategic commands, Allied Command Operation is his role is to focus on current operations, all the operations we are conducting now. And my command, we are preparing future operations. And we are looking at the future and see what will be the game changer and what we need to adapt in order to stay relevant in the foreseeable future. And just to explain that, I would like to quote Secretary Mattis. I met him in a conference in July, and he said something that exactly illustrates what I've just said. He said that without adaptation, you can be dominant and irrelevant at the same time. And because NATO has 2 strategic commands, we can stay dominant and relevant. And this is exactly our role. And we use the adaptation to reclarify some of the roles and responsibilities between the 2 strategic commands. And, but it worked well. So we made this assessment, but what are the principles behind this adaptation of our decision making? The main principle is responsiveness. If we recognize that we have potential adversaries at our borders, we need to be very responsive. And again, NATO forgot a bit about this in the past. And very responsive means that we need to have in the NATO command structure all the necessary elements to react very quickly to a crisis, or to a crisis that could escalate to a conflict. And we need to go very seamlessly from peacetime to crisis to conflict. And that's another objective. And we need, because we know that we will be surprised because of the complexity of the world I talked about, we need to be sure that we have a structure which is flexible by design. Because this is many times a question we receive from our countries, and they say, you are proposing now an adaptation of the command structure. How are you sure that in 1 year it will still be relevant? And the structure we are recommending today, and that has been approved 2 weeks ago by the nations, the structure we have built it flexible by design. The way to build it flexible by design is to implement in the structure the basic functions we need to react very quickly, but to associate much better the NATO command structure and what we call the NATO force structure. Because I said to you, NATO is made up of 29 nations. Those nations participate in the NATO command structure, but they have their own structure and their own expertise. And the issue behind the adaptation was to be sure that we associate much better permanently with a permanent exchange of information, the NATO command structure and the capacities of the nations. And that gives us the flexibility to react to any kind of scenario. This was not the easiest part of it, but our recommendation was based on this principle. And just to mention to you some of the key elements that was missing when we said that it was just partially fit for purpose. Cyber was not implemented in our command structure, and I said to you that in Warsaw it has been declared as a fifth domain. So how do we integrate cyber in our command structure today? There could have been two ways to do that. A first approach could have been to create a cyber command, as we have an air command, a maritime command. We didn't choose this option. We much prefer to organize what we call a federated cyber. How we federate all the capacities in this dimension of our 29 nations and of partner nations as well. How we associate them in order to combine our effect, because we have proved that in this cyber domain, the detection and the reaction is much better when you associate many different entities than only one. So we are implementing that now with the Cyber Operational Center, which will be located in the operational command in Belgium, but federating what exists in the nations. Another thing is, if we have to go to what we call a maximum level of effort, which is a conflict, an open conflict, we assess that the logistics was not really well organized, because this is still a national responsibility. So in this case, we need to have a new command that organizes the logistics for the whole theater, for the whole Euro-Atlantic area. So this command, because we wanted to have it flexible, will not be another command part of the NATO command structure. It will be based on the framework nation, and Germany volunteered for that, and with a nucleus. And this nucleus can be grown up and augmented very quickly in case the situation dictates. Same for the sea lines of communication across the Atlantic. If we recognize that we need to be prepared for a major conflict, how we protect the sea lines of communication across the Atlantic, especially for the reinforcement of the forces coming from Canada and USA. And in the past, in the Cold War, we had a command for that, but due to the different phases of NATO history, this is something that disappeared. So again, we will not have a major conflict every day, hopefully, and we will do everything to avoid that. So this will be based, this new command, Joint Force Command Atlantic, it will be based on a framework nation, and USA volunteered for that, which makes sense, because I don't believe that US carriers could be commanded by an officer who is not American anyway. And this command will be located, it's still not decided. I believe Norfolk could be a good position, and will be located based on the framework nation with some element of the nations inside, and be able to grow up very quickly in case the situation dictates. It's another big part of the adaptation. There are many others, but let's say there are some of the main adaptations that we have proposed. This has been approved by the nation, so now we are building the implementation plan. And finally, with this adaptation, we need, as I said, to continuously look at the future and be sure that the flexibility will help us face any kind of challenges in the foreseeable future. So what are the principles we need to set up in order to be sure that we can have this agility in the future? And this is the role of my command. And we had the idea to go to the Silicon Valley and to see how these big successful IT companies, they adapted to this environment, because their objective may be different, but the environment is the same. The complexity of the environment is the same. And we could draw some principles which are absolutely transferable to our military institutions. And again, these principles to deal with complexity. The first one is the recognition that no organization or state or entity, enterprise has alone every key to solve a problem. So, which is translated for us as no one organization or no nation has all the keys to face a crisis. And this is really one of the key principles of this century for me. And we see that the most successful organizations are the organizations who have been ready to build an ecosystem in which they can exchange information and work together. In fact, NATO is already this, but this is why we are continuously developing, increasing our partnerships with many other nations, with think tanks, with many entities, because we recognize that we need to build this ecosystem in order to be more responsive in the future. Second thing, and I talked about the importance of strategic awareness and of global strategic awareness that is not limited to a specific area. And in this strategic awareness, something which is important is that many of the information are not limited to the let's say intelligence system. We can find many very relevant information in open source, publicly available information, providing that we are able to scan this information and get what is of interest. And this is an issue we are working on now. Another principle is complexity renders surprise inevitable. If we consider that what we built will avoid surprise, we are wrong. In the complexity of our world today, we will be surprised. We can just try to minimize the surprise or build our resilience, which is another principle, in order to be sure that we can recover from any shocks. But we will be surprised, and we need to recognize it. Another principle is the emergence of disruptive technologies present new threats, but also offers many opportunities, providing that we understand these technologies, and understand again how they can threaten our superiority, but offer us new opportunities to be more responsive and more effective. But these technologies, if we want to consider them correctly, we need to understand that they may change considerably the way we conduct warfare, and we need to be open to that. Finally, in a world that is increasingly driven by technology, artificial intelligence, human capital is more important than ever. We need to continue to develop this human capital, make it aware of the complexity of the world, and ready to face any kind of challenge. Our human capital is really our key strategic resource. When I visited Google, we wanted to see many things, and they spend 80% of the time talking about their human capital, and they are right. So that's something important. So these principles can apply to any kind of organization today, including our military organization. And I would like to put a certain focus on innovation, because we are working on this today. Why on innovation? Especially we have started working on disruptive technologies and try to make our stakeholders understand how these disruptive technologies, why there is an urgency to understand and develop these technologies. And why it is urgent to understand them, again, because of the threats that can raise, and because those technologies can be used by a wide, again, spectrum of actors. But many opportunities as well. And what is important for me is to be sure that our stakeholders, they understand this and understand the challenges in terms of interoperability. Interoperability, you know, this is a way we can work together with different countries. It has always been the strength of NATO to build this interoperability of the forces between our nations. However, when we talk about interoperability regarding artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, the key issue is not the technical part of it. The technical part of it, we will make it happen. The technology exists. But the biggest problem is the political part of it. How we are sure that we will have the same level of acceptance by our 29 nations of certain level of autonomy of our military systems. And we are not. But if we do not look at this issue now, we may deploy forces which will be not able to work together because our nations will not agree with the same level. And that's absolutely essential. And on the 22nd of March, we will have a big meeting with the ambassadors in Brussels we organize, in which we will raise this issue. We will bring some specialists in artificial intelligence and then an autonomous system, and we'll try to raise the political issues. And because that requires big changes in our policies in many different areas. And I know that, I think that you are working on this issue in this university, but that's very important. And in the policies, and again, we need to be open to change the way we operate. And I would like to quote again a very recent declaration from Secretary Jim Mattis, who served, you know, in uniform for more than 30 years, and he is very experienced in combat and high administration. And by the way, he is also one of my predecessors as a Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. And a few weeks ago, in an interview, he was asked about artificial intelligence and the emergence of disruptive technologies. And he answered that he had spent his entire career being absolutely convinced that the principles of war were set in stone and would never change. But now he believes that we have to be extremely agile and open-minded when considering future challenges, because they are likely to transform profoundly the way we operate. And this is part of the many programs that we have opened in my command, especially looking at future autonomous system. And that's, but again, the key issue for us is to be sure that all of our nation, they have the same understanding, and they work together, and they set the condition to use these technologies in the future. So I will stop here to open the questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes?
Yeah, so my question is, like, you talked about the commander structure of NATO. So my question is, how strongly is that, does that cascade into security assistance missions and countries like Afghanistan, for example, where you had troop contributing countries that they pretty much leveraged the decision-making, the military decision-making in different parts of the country where they had their military units. So how does the command structure really cascades to the ground when you have security assistance missions? Thank you very
much. Thank you for this question. And again, this structure, this is a decision-making structure in NATO, and the decisions are made by the political level, which makes sense. And then the political level, once they have made decisions, they are translated into military tasks. We receive both allied command operation and allied command transformation. For the example you have just mentioned, Afghanistan, you know that 2 years ago we were supposed to go to a next phase, which will be a more Kabul-centric phase, more a political phase than what we do today. And there was an important assessment of the situation on the ground. And this assessment has been presented to the nations, to the 29 ambassadors. And in this assessment, we clearly recognize that the conditions to go to the next phase were not met, and they are still not met today. And then the nations accepted during this meeting that we need to wait for the transition to the next phase, and even they accepted to recommit more forces. The NATO part of it is a training and assist mission. But the nations recognize the need to deploy more forces in order to continue the work, because in Afghanistan we can see still challenges, but we have real progresses. But again, it's still not the good. It's still not time to move to another more political operation. I believe that we will stay like this many years again, in order to have a better stabilization of the situation, and nations have recognized it. So now there was this big decision at this time, but now nations are recommitting their forces quite easily, because they recognize the progress is made and the value of continuing the process. I mean, we have not spent so many years there, lost many lives, just to withdraw now, where we see that there's still a possibility to have a better future for the country. And this is how it cascades. Political decisions, sometimes provided based on military assessment, and then it cascades again to orders. And this is really another value of our organization. When we provide military advice, this is always an unfettered military advice. And I would say that sometimes in my country, you know, the military advice, you have many layers, and when the advice arrives to the decision making at the political level, it could be a bit different from the real advice. Here in NATO, all the processes are made that are made in a way that our military advice goes directly to the political stakeholder, which is a value. After that, they decide, but it's unfettered, and that's great.
Thank you very much. Over the last months, the European Union has increased its measures to improve its common security and defense policy and initiated the permanent structured cooperation. And my question for you would be, is a potential European defense cooperation a threat to NATO cohesion, or should NATO in fact encourage closer EU defense cooperation to potentially increase defense spending among its European allies?
And the answer to that is, I said that in the Warsaw Summit we have a joint declaration between NATO and EU, and this is a recognition of the work that we must do in order to improve the complementarity of the two organizations. It's never easy, but the value of this is, again, as I mentioned, that provides us with a good political framework to improve our cooperation. The new decision made in the European Union are really complementary to what we do, and I will give you what my personal feeling of that. In the NATO command structure adaptation, because I mentioned the responsiveness that we need to have. In the past, we considered that the NATO command structure adaptation could be deployable, and we said, no, we do not have time to deploy if we recognize that we have adversaries at our borders. So we need to consolidate the resilience of the NATO command structure and not make it deployable again. However, because we still have the task to conduct expeditionary operations, if it's necessary, who is going to provide the deployable capacities? Answer is nations. And NATO is today refocusing more, including its training training program on collective defense, which gives less room for crisis management, non-Article 5 training. And we tell the nations, this is your role to provide the deployable capacities, and this is your role to train them, and we can help you, of course, and organize it. And I say that because if I look at what the European Union has said recently, European Union could organize this crisis management training in coordination with us, while NATO is focusing more on collective defense, and then we are very strong because we are working together. Still under discussion, because it's never easy, but again, this is the way we are building together the future. And regarding the capability development, we have a good agreement. I'm in charge of most of the part of what we call the NATO defense planning process, which is developing the target for the nations to develop their capabilities to meet the NATO's level of ambition. And I am coordinating that quite well with the European Defence Agency. And in fact, we call that a coordination of outputs, which is a big improvement for what we have done before. So we are sure that the priorities we define for the nations are the same. Otherwise, the nations would spend their money in two different ways, and then the money, the finance are not that large today in the defense budget. So we have, this is again permanent improvement. What I've seen is in all the ministerial meetings we have had since 2 years, the High Representative of the European Union was invited, and the Secretary General of NATO has always been invited in the one conducting in the European part. This is just an illustration of this implementation of the Joint Declaration.
The rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin in the last 2 years, it seems sometimes more inflammatory than even during the Cold War, where they've talked about bombing Western European cities and bombing the United States. To what degree is this simply dismissed in Europe as just political rhetoric, or is it alarming people? And we do note that not only were there cyber involvement in our election here, but also in European elections, and one of your candidates, without mentioning names, took a loan from a bank in Cyprus that was a front for the intelligence service of Russia, and we know that Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has said favorable things about Putin in the British system. So we have far left-wing and right-wing parties that appear to be aligning themselves to some degree with Putin while these threats are being made. To what degree is there political unrest in Europe now that is threatening the alliance?
In fact, Russia has made some declarations that NATO is an adversary. NATO has not declared Russia as an adversary, but this is clearly a threat. And it's a threat because, again, Russia has violated the international laws and keep violating international laws in many different areas. And the last one was the big exercise Zapad they conducted last year. In this exercise, there is the Vienna Convention that says that when you conduct an exercise that involves more than 13,000 people, you need to declare it, and you need to have observers from many different countries and everything. And Zapad involved more than 20,000 soldiers, probably much more than that, and they said it was below the threshold of 13,000, which is another obvious violation. And I can mention many of them. And this is why, and the recent declaration of Mr. Putin that pointed out our countries as potential targets has been considered unacceptable by NATO. However, as I mentioned, Russia is not a declared adversary. So what we do now, I mentioned that Russia is still a member of the Partnership of Peace, but okay, we have put that on hold. And the second thing is that we have reinforced our defense and deterrence posture, and it was part of the decision in Warsaw I just mentioned. And because we feel that to continue to discuss with Mr. Putin, we need to be strong, and we need to be very strong, because this is something he understands. This is what we are doing, but the channels of communication are still open at the political level, are still open at the military level. and providing that they want to come to the table. And that's very important. That's very important. That's very important that we continue to talk with Russia, but to talk with Russia with a very robust, credible deterrence posture.
Thank you for your interesting speech. My question is related to NATO's enlargement policy, particularly talking about Georgia. During 10 years, Georgia is a strong partner of NATO, and but up until now, membership action plan it has not received. So my question is, like many NATO member countries are concerned with the reality that if in case Georgia enters and joins the alliance, it will trigger the war to Russia, because there are 2 breakaway regions in Georgia, 2 occupied territories. In total, 20% of the country is occupied by Russia currently. So what if Georgian government will accept the arrangement of membership in a way that Article number 5 does not cover occupied territories until they are not resolved peacefully? Do you think this is a reasonable scenario? And if yes, will it accelerate the pace of NATO-Georgia relations in terms of membership?
You raise a good question, this open door policy, which is still open. And NATO has demonstrated that last year with the integration of Montenegro, which became the 29th nation. Many other countries are at the door, and probably the most advanced one is Georgia, as you mentioned. And Georgia is the second contributing nation to the forces in Afghanistan, and everything that has been requested to Georgia and in terms of exercises, preparation of forces, change in even in the constitution, everything, Georgia has done everything. So and really they are ready on the military side. On the political side, it is considered by NATO that the rule is the rule. So we could not see a nation joining NATO without and with some compromise regarding the Article 5. That would not make sense. Or this is called a partnership, and this is what we do today. To speak frankly with you, I discussed with many NATO nations who would like now to force this open door and say they are ready, do it. And some other nations who are a bit afraid of the Russian reactions because of the part of Georgia you mentioned. And I believe that on the political agenda it will take more time, but the door is still open and probably waiting for an opportunity. And that's really now a political issue. On the military side, we have done everything we could, and I'm personally I will go to Georgia in June because they have implemented some very interesting centers for NATO. Especially, they have a partnership center which is doing great training for many nations. We have tied this partnership center to one of the NATO centers that is subordinated to me. We are working very closely. Now Georgia is organizing NATO exercises every 2 years, which is the only partner doing that. And we try to do our best to keep Georgia in our side, let's say. But on the political issue, it's consensus-based, and the condition to have a consensus at 29 nations to integrate Georgia are still not met.
General, you talked about the need for NATO to look outside of area to anticipate crises and try to deal with them before they get into conflictual situations. But the tension there, of course, is that when NATO operates out of area, it's much more difficult to get the political consensus that you're talking about, whether it's in the Mediterranean or the Middle East or Ukraine or other out-of-area contingencies. Could you talk a little bit about that tension?
Yes, you are right. First, I said that we need to look at outside our borders to build our strategic awareness. So this is not a crisis. It's just how we partner with many nations in order to understand the world and the balance between nations in order to, again, detect the early signs of crisis. However, what you say is exactly part of the discussion we have now, and especially we have a big discussion on the potential role of NATO in Iraq in support of the coalition. And especially NATO has an activity, what we call an activity in Iraq, is performing some specific training in some specific areas. And nations have approved recently, but still need more work on the implementation, to go from what we call an activity to a mission. So probably at the next summit, nations will approve a NATO mission in Iraq. Again, like we do in Afghanistan, train and assist. It's not, it will be a non-combat mission. In fact, this is always a big discussion, especially in NATO. My view on that is that when we talk with the other big international organizations, and we organized a workshop in Washington last year, the other international organizations and many nations have the feeling that when NATO shows up, NATO wants to lead. And in fact, no. NATO could be just in support of operations led by a coalition or another international organization. And this is a question of how we interact, how we define the supported role of the different international organizations. This is the area we need to continue to work on in order to see what are the best values of these organizations. You know that my country has been conducted operations in Sahel area for many years, and why not use the NATO reconnaissance surveillance system? Why not? Why not? And I think that again today, to deal with today's complexity, we need to be more open than this is a coalition, this is NATO, this is EU. It's more complicated than that. In fact, on the field, it works well. When I see the coordination between UN, EU, and NATO in Afghanistan, the coordination goes well, but it has been built on the local basis, and we probably need to have a stronger policy regarding that. One of the key issues for that is that when we talk about non-NATO nations and especially defense capacity building, how we help non-NATO nations to build their own resilience, we have the tendency to go 1 year after another year. And this is exactly what we try to promote for Iraq today. If we do a mission, but the objective of the mission will be year after year, as we do now, the other international organizations, they do the same. And how can you coordinate any objectives on this basis? So if we want to have a better coordination of objectives, we probably need to define a 3 to 5 year plan. Then we can have objective we coordinate, and then we can start to see how we can cooperate together. As long as we will not define this 3 to 5 year plan, it's going to be very difficult to associate different organizations. Thus, to have a clear vision of what nations want for the different international organizations, because your question is not limited to NATO.
Probably time for one more quick question.
So NATO has deployed about 4 battalions to the Baltics, a partisan defense forward presence. However, the RAND Corporation analysis said you need at least 7 brigades in order to have a minimal, credible, conventional deterrent. How is NATO planning to address this discrepancy?
Yeah, thank you. First, I have some doubts about this result from the RAND study, because I think this is based on how we conducted operation before. But apart from that, NATO has never said, again, as I mentioned, NATO has not recognized Russia as an adversary. So the deployment of these forces are not to build divisions against divisions, because we do not consider it as an adversary. This is a threat. So the deployment is just a deployment of forces that says that look, we are all here. So it would not be an attack on Poland or on Lithuania. It would be a real attack against all, because we are all deployed. And this is why we are there. This is a part of the deterrence, but a non-aggressive deterrence, because NATO is a defensive organization. And even if on the other side of the border, Russia has regrouped many forces, we do not want to be aggressive. We just want to say, look, we are here, and if there is an attack against one, all of us, we will answer. And then to be credible, we need to reinforce our responsiveness, as I mentioned, and especially we need to reinforce our capacity to have follow-on forces, reinforcement of forces very quickly, and we are working on this in the adaptation.
Any closing comments you'd like to make?
I would say that when I go to many countries, NATO is sometimes an organization that is differently, let's say the perception is different, especially when I see my country or when I go to some European countries. They may have the tendency to consider that this is an organization heavily led by US. When I go to Washington, many have the tendency to consider that this is a European organization. So we need to continue to work on these issues, and as I mentioned, we need to be sure that we understand the value of this big international organization for our peace and security, and this is something we need to continue to work on, and especially I look at the young people here in this room. Continue to show an interest on this big international organization, because really they are the best guarantee of our stability. And an example of that is when we had many perceptions from different nations regarding other nations and problems. And to mention that clearly, I was, for instance, in Hungary last week, and we discussed the perceptions they have regarding the Ukraine minority, which might be different from the other nations and everything. And there is a question of Turkey, and there is a question. But the value of NATO, we have a very good framework with trust that has been established for years, and the diplomacy expresses much better than if we had only some bilateral relations. So that's very important that we have this kind of organization. The value of NATO is, again, to associate USA and Canada with European countries, and based on this, we can have a much better agreement between nations. Consensus is never easy, but we have always found consensus, again, to ensure a better stability in our world. So I would continue to encourage you to understand those organizations and the value of them, and help them if you can. We are conducting many works in my command, including the trends that look at the future crisis and everything, and we use what we call an innovation hub. If you go to our website, you will find this innovation hub. You can register, and then you can participate in all this work. And I would encourage you to do it. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you.